What's up everyone, my name is Soren Iverson, I'm a product designer at Cash App, and today I'm going to share with you 7 typography tips that every product designer should know. Let's get started. The first tip is to use existing type systems. Let's look at what this means. Material Design actually has an entire website that walks through a lot of their typography documentation, and one of the things that I really like is you can look at any Google font and see the font, the weight, the size, the letter spacing, and then you could also change what the caption typography would be, and you can construct an entire type system without ever leaving the web. You can also see what this looks like in code. They'll walk you through the basics of type scale, font size units, letter spacing units, applying type scale, and so much more. It's a really helpful primer if you're just getting started with material design. Another helpful resource I've found is Apple's Human Interface Guidelines. This is a screenshot, but if we look at the actual site, you can see that they have everything from branding to color to icons. But then if we go down here to typography, you can see that they have an intro to typography, best practices, how to use system fonts, and then if we scroll down, in this section they specify dynamic type sizes that are used in iOS. The good thing is that if you follow this, it's much easier for engineers to build things that are more accessible. If you go to the display and text size section of your phone, you'll see that there's the ability to turn on larger text and you can actually change text size. If you follow these guidelines, it'll be much easier for an engineer to implement things that are more accessible for people that might be using it with larger or smaller type sizes. The question you might have is, how do you get all of this information into your Figma files? Thankfully, Zachary Hunt has taken the typography that's associated with Apple's Human Interface Guidelines and already made it into Figma files that you can easily duplicate from the Figma community. If you see here, he's got everything for SF Pro Display. This was made over a year ago, but it looks like it's still being updated somewhat regularly. The next tip is that less is more. Let's take a look at this website. You can see here that there's actually 3 different fonts and 6 different weights of that font. You've got a serif here, you've got a monospace here, you've got sans serifs. It's really inconsistent, and even though visually it doesn't look bad, it could be a lot more polished up. If we look at this screen, it shows the same site, but it's been simplified to use only 1 font and 3 weights of that font. There's a medium weight, the bolder weight. Using too many fonts is an easy trap for designers to fall into. I used to fall into this trap, but I've realized that restraining your type choices to 1 or 2 weights max will make things much easier to scale and easier to manage for both you and the engineers that you'll be working with as you're building things. The next tip I have for you is using color for contrast. Let's look at the before and after here. On the left, we have a blog post card that's using the default black color for both the headline and the body copy. On the right, there's a very slight alteration. The black headline is a slightly off black. It's a little bit less intense. And then the body text is a little bit lighter gray. If we zoom in, you can more easily see these changes here. There's no contrast between the headline and the body copy. This is a heavier weight, this is a lighter weight, but over here you start to get this, which draws your attention a little bit more, and this is a bit more subtle. It's the small details like this that make your designs visually superior. Now let's look at base 8 spacing. 8-point spacing means that the value you use to separate items is always divisible by 8. So that's 8, 16, 24, 32, 48, 64, or 80. Theoretically, you could also do things like 144, 208, but these are the most common values. Also, if you're doing incredibly small nuanced detail work, sometimes you can use 4 pixels or 12 pixels, but typically you try to stick with these values. Let's look at how this actually plays on a design. So on the left, we have that blog post card that we looked at earlier, and it's not using base 8. We can see you've got 25 pixels of spacing here, you've got 25 here, then there's no spacing between these 2 elements, and then between this one and this one, there's 30 pixels. Between this card and this, there's 30 pixels, and then there's 25 here. It's still consistent, but it doesn't feel great. And so if we look over here, this is using base 8. So there's 32 pixels here, 24 here, 8 here, and then 32 here. I added a zoomed in view here so we can look at how base 8 actually plays out. On the left and right side, you've got 24 pixels of spacing. On the top and bottom, you have 32 pixels of spacing. We want to keep the headline and the body copy close, but not too close. So there's only 8 pixels here. And we want to keep it separate from the button below. So we have 32 pixels of space here. This is a fairly simple representation of how base 8 works. And at first it can be uncomfortable to operate in this sort of way. But once you get used to it, you'll realize that you're designing much faster and that the work you're making is far more visually balanced and consistent. The fifth tip I have for you is not to go too small. The general guidance I see on typography and product design is that you shouldn't go below 12 pixels, but if you look at the US government's website, they actually want you to keep body copy above 16 pixels in size. There are a lot of apps that I use on a day-to-day basis that don't follow this rule, but people often use the settings on their phone to make type sizes larger than what comes in the app by default. There are a lot of people in the world that have some sort of visual impairment that makes it difficult for them to read, and so keeping body copy and just text in general a large size is good. Let's look at an example. If we look at the mobile version of the site that I showed you earlier, on the left, the reviews, color, and size headlines aren't just below 16 pixels, they're actually below 12 pixels. Even though a lot of apps use this as an eyebrow size, it's really difficult to read for a lot of people. On the right, we've increased that text size to 16 pixels, and you can see it's much easier to read and will be more accessible for people that might be visually impaired. The next tip I have for you is to give text space to breathe. There are two ways to make typography breathe better. The first is letter spacing. You can see here, this text feels tight, and if we increase the letter spacing a little bit, it becomes easier to read, especially if you zoom out a bit. If we look at the body copy, the line spacing feels pretty tight, but if we increase this maybe 4 or 5 points, it's much easier on the eyes to read. Let's do this for the headline too. Let's actually just copy and paste the styling that we have from over here, and as you can see, it's far more easy to read once we've applied that new styling. The last tip I have for you is to avoid center aligning text. Let's look at that blog postcard one last time. You can see that paragraphs of centered aligned text can be difficult to read. You can get away with center aligning things if you only have a headline and a button, but the minute that you add body copy, center aligning things starts to break. Trying to read paragraphs of centered aligned text is very difficult to do. There's a reason that books, text messages, email, social media apps, and work chat applications all use left aligned text. It's easier to read and far less visually straining. If you have to use center aligned text, try to keep it to headlines and avoid using it in body copy if at all possible. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that you feel better equipped to use typography in your day-to-day work as a product designer. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Soren, and I'll see you in the next video.